They say legends never really die. But when Richard Smallwood passed at 77, something shifted in the gospel world. Because this wasn't just the loss of a songwriter. This was the silence of a man whose music carried entire churches through grief, revival, and survival. And when Donnie McClurkin broke down in a stunning tribute, it revealed something most fans never realized about Smallwood's private influence. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why his death feels less like an ending and more like the closing of a sacred era. The death of Richard Smallwood at 77 didn't just make headlines. It triggered something far deeper across Black churches, gospel choirs, and worship spaces around the world. Because for millions of believers, Smallwood's music wasn't something you simply listened to. It was something you leaned on, something you cried through, something you sang when words failed. And that's why the reaction to his passing has been so overwhelming, so emotional, and in some cases, surprisingly revealing. For decades, Richard Smallwood stood in a rare space where musical brilliance and spiritual authority met. He wasn't just a gospel artist. He was a trained composer, a Howard University graduate, and a scholar who understood classical structure just as deeply as Pentecostal praise. That dual identity allowed him to do something almost no one else could: elevate Black church music without stripping it of its soul. In a genre often divided between tradition and innovation, Smallwood became the bridge. As tributes pour in from pastors, singers, and worship leaders, one moment has captured particular attention: Donnie McClurkin's tribute. It wasn't polished, it wasn't performative, it was raw, emotional, and deeply personal. And in that moment, McClurkin revealed what many fans never fully understood: that Richard Smallwood's influence extended far beyond the songs we hear on Sunday mornings. He shaped ministries, he shaped theology, he shaped how worship felt. This video isn't just about honoring a legend, it's about unpacking why his death feels like the end of an era. We're going to break down his rise from a gifted child prodigy to a musical architect of modern worship. We'll examine how his compositions quietly redefined gospel standards, and we'll look closely at why leaders like Bishop William Murphy and Jamal Bryant speak about him with a reverence usually reserved for spiritual elders, not musicians. But there's also another layer: the pressure, the responsibility, and the weight of being the standard. Because when your music becomes the soundtrack for funerals, altar calls, and national tragedies, the burden is heavier than applause. And in Richard Smallwood's case, that burden shaped everything. By the end of this video, you won't just understand who Richard Smallwood was, you'll understand why his absence feels so loud, and why the most powerful part of his legacy may be what he carried silently long before the world ever noticed. Long before Richard Smallwood became a gospel legend, he was simply a gifted child with an uncommon ear for music. Born in Atlanta and raised in Washington, D.C., Smallwood began playing the piano at just 5 years old, an early sign of the precision and sensitivity that would later define his work. But what set him apart wasn't just natural talent. It was discipline, structure, and a deep reverence for excellence that followed him into adulthood. His formal training at Howard University would become one of the most important chapters of his life. Howard wasn't just a school, it was an incubator of Black excellence, theology, and artistry. Immersed in classical composition, theory, and choral arrangement, Smallwood learned how to write music that could stand on any stage, sacred or secular. Yet, even in those academic halls, his calling never drifted from the church. Pastor Jamal Bryant would later reflect on Howard's role in shaping Smallwood, noting that the university birthed one of the best and brightest minds gospel music has ever known. That education gave Smallwood the tools to do something revolutionary: to treat gospel music with the same compositional seriousness as classical works, without losing the spirit that made it powerful. When he formed the Richard Smallwood Singers, it became clear this wasn't a typical choir. The arrangements were complex, the harmonies were layered, the lyrics were deeply theological. Songs like Trust Me and I Love the Lord didn't just invite praise, they demanded reflection. They required the listener to engage emotionally and spiritually. This approach wasn't always easy to maintain. In a genre often driven by trends and emotional peaks, Smallwood stayed committed to structure, even when it meant pushing choirs beyond their comfort zones. But that discipline became his signature. Choir directors began using his music as training material. Churches began measuring musical excellence by his standard. Slowly, quietly, Richard Smallwood became the blueprint. Yet, behind the growing influence was a man carrying immense responsibility. When your music becomes the soundtrack for worship across denominations, every note matters, every word matters. And that pressure to never miss, never falter, would shape both his public image and his private life in ways few people ever saw. There are songs that top charts, and then there are songs that enter culture. Richard Smallwood's music did the latter, and no composition proves that more than Total Praise. Written in 1996, the song wasn't created for radio dominance or commercial success. It was written for worship, pure, reverent, unfiltered worship. Yet somehow it became one of the most recognizable gospel anthems in the world. What made Total Praise different wasn't just its message, it was its structure. Built like a classical hymn, the song progresses with intentional restraint. No rushing, no emotional manipulation, just a steady, reverent climb that mirrors prayer itself. Choir directors often say the song teaches singers how to breathe spiritually, not just vocally. That kind of precision doesn't happen by accident. It's the result of Richard Smallwood's deep academic training meeting his Pentecostal faith. Over time, Total Praise stopped being a song and became a moment. It's sung at funerals when grief is too heavy for words. It's sung at national memorials, graduation ceremonies, and revival services. And in Black churches across America, the opening chord alone can silence a room. Congregations don't clap, they don't shout, they stand because the song demands reverence. Smallwood's catalog is filled with similar spiritual architecture. I Love the Lord gained renewed life when Whitney Houston performed it in The Preacher's Wife, introducing Smallwood's writing to a global audience. Trust Me spoke directly to believers navigating uncertainty and loss. Each song carried theology, not just emotion, scripture woven into melody. And yet, despite his influence, Smallwood never chased celebrity. He rarely inserted himself into controversy. He avoided the spotlight that consumed many of his peers. That restraint only deepened the respect surrounding his name. Pastors didn't just invite him to perform, they trusted him to set the atmosphere. That trust extended to an entire generation of gospel artists. Donnie McClurkin, Kim Burrell, and countless worship leaders have openly credited Smallwood as a blueprint for excellence, not because he told them how to sing, but because he showed them how to prepare. His music raised expectations, choirs rehearsed longer, directors studied harder, worship became intentional again. But behind the growing influence was constant cost. When your music becomes the soundtrack for people's most sacred moments, the weight doesn't disappear when the service ends. And as Smallwood aged, that burden, spiritual, emotional, and physical, quietly followed him. For years, Richard Smallwood was viewed as almost untouchable, not because he was distant, but because his excellence felt effortless. Every composition was precise, every arrangement felt intentional, every performance carried a quiet authority. But what Donnie McClurkin revealed in his emotional tribute after Smallwood's death pulled a curtain many fans never realized existed. McClurkin didn't just praise Smallwood's music, he spoke about the weight of it, the responsibility of being the standard, the pressure of knowing when you write a song, it may be the last thing someone hears before they bury a loved one, or the only prayer they have left when faith feels thin. That kind of calling doesn't clock out. Those close to Smallwood have long hinted that he carried his role deeply, sometimes too deeply. While other artists navigated trends, collaborations, and commercial success, Smallwood remained fixed on integrity. He refused to dilute his sound. He refused to simplify his compositions for mass appeal. And that commitment came with isolation. When you hold the line, you often stand alone. In Donnie McClurkin's tribute, there was a moment, brief but unmistakable, where emotion overtook composure. It wasn't just grief, it was recognition. Recognition that Smallwood poured himself out for the church in ways most people will never fully understand. That he protected the sanctity of worship, even when the industry was moving in a different direction. Bishop William Murphy echoed this sentiment, calling Smallwood the perfect mix of the educated Negro and the Pentecostal pastor. That balance wasn't accidental. It required constant restraint, knowing how far to push musically without breaking spiritual accessibility, knowing how to challenge choirs without alienating congregations. That kind of leadership happens behind the scenes long before applause. As Smallwood aged, health challenges and physical limitations